Communities around the world are experiencing rapid, often unexpected environmental and social changes, from extreme weather and drought to shifting mobility patterns and public health disruptions. These changes challenge the stability of places and the ways people interact with their environments. Spatial resilience helps us understand how communities observe, interpret, and respond to such changes by integrating spatial thinking, local knowledge, and environmental awareness. In an era defined by abundant data, interconnected systems, and accelerating change, the ability to analyze environments spatially is no longer optional. It is essential for resilience, safety, and long-term sustainability. In this module, we will explore how spatial resilience is conceptualized, why place matters, and how GIS offers a critical viewpoint for analyzing environmental change and community response. As we begin this topic, it's important to be clear about what we aim to understand. Our focus here is spatial resilience, not just resilience in general, but how it takes shape differently across places and geographies. By the end of this section, you'll be able to explain the key elements that drive vulnerability, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and understand how spatial inequality creates uneven risks across communities. We'll also look at the systems and dynamics behind resilience, explore how GIS helps us visualize these patterns, and see how multi-layer analysis, scenario modeling, and regional comparisons reveal deeper resilience gaps. Together, these objectives will give us the foundation we need for interpreting resilience through a spatial lens. Sustainability balance. Achieving long-term sustainability requires balancing environmental protection, economic viability, and social well-being without advancing one at the expense of the others. Spatial resilience. Spatial resilience focuses on how communities anticipate, absorb, and adapt to change based on the geographic conditions and spatial relationships. Exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. Resilience emerges from how much a community is exposed to hazards, how sensitive it is to their impacts, and how well it can adapt or recover. Spatial inequality. Risks and resources are unevenly distributed across space, causing some communities to experience greater impacts than others. Place-based decision-making. Effective resilience planning requires decisions that are tailored to the specific geographic realities and lived experiences of each community. When we talk about resilience, we often speak in general terms, how systems withstand shocks or adapt over time. But resilience always plays out in specific places, not in abstractions. Spatial resilience focuses on how resilience is shaped by geography. It helps us understand why the same event affects communities differently depending on their physical environment, infrastructure, and local conditions. By examining where exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity appear on a map, we can see patterns that are impossible to detect through numbers alone. This place-based lens shows us where vulnerabilities are forming, where existing strengths provide stability, and how risks are distributed across a landscape. In today's world, with climate pressures, rapid urbanization, and social inequality, grounding resilience in geography is essential. Spatial resilience gives structure to what resilience looks like in real communities, helping us interpret complex interactions in a clear and actionable way. Now that we've defined spatial resilience, we can explore why the spatial dimension matters so deeply in practice. Space determines who is exposed, how severely they are affected, and how quickly they can recover. Even within the same city, two neighborhoods can experience identical events, heat waves, flooding, service disruptions, yet face very different outcomes because their spatial characteristics differ. The built environment, access to services, land use patterns, and social conditions interact to create uneven levels of risk. This is why resilience cannot be approached with one-size-fits-all solutions. By mapping these spatial differences with GIS, we uncover the structure behind unequal impacts, where resources are lacking, where infrastructure amplifies risk, and where investment will create the greatest benefit. Space matters because it brings clarity. It reveals disparities that would otherwise remain hidden and lays the foundation for targeted, equitable resilience strategies tailored to the realities of each community. As we move deeper into spatial resilience, another critical dimension becomes clear. Resilience is not distributed equally. Even when communities appear geographically close, they do not share the same level of exposure or the same capacity to respond. Social, economic, and environmental conditions shape vulnerability in profound ways. Factors such as income levels, infrastructure quality, housing conditions, mobility, and environmental burden all influence how severely a place experiences a hazard. Because these conditions vary widely, risks tend to cluster. Some neighborhoods repeatedly absorb more impact, while others remain relatively insulated. This spatial inequality weakens overall resilience, limiting how quickly communities can adapt or recover. By mapping these disparities with GIS, we can identify where impacts accumulate and which groups are carrying disproportionate risk. This insight is essential, not only for understanding vulnerability but also for designing fair, targeted, and effective resilience strategies. As we build on the idea of spatial inequality, the next step is understanding what drives these differences. Resilience is shaped by three key elements: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure tells us where hazards meet people or infrastructure. Sensitivity shows how strongly those areas are impacted. Adaptive capacity reflects how well a community can respond and recover. When we map these three dimensions together, GIS gives us a clearer picture of why some places face deeper risk than others. It highlights true hotspots, areas where targeted investments and policy shifts can create the biggest improvement in resilience. In other words, this approach helps us move from broad assumptions to precise, place-based strategies. Now that we've explored how risk is unevenly distributed across space, the next step is understanding what actually shapes resilience in the first place. Resilience is not determined by a single factor, it emerges from the interaction of multiple spatial systems. Natural systems influence how hazards behave, whether they are absorbed, amplified, or slowed. The built environment determines how disruptions spread and how quickly services can be restored. And social networks, often invisible on the map, play a major role in how effectively a community can coordinate, communicate, and support one another. When we view these layers together, we see that resilience is fundamentally spatial. It's shaped by ecosystems, infrastructure, and human connections interacting across geography. This systems view helps us understand why some places recover faster, why others struggle, and where strategic improvements can have the greatest impact. As we look deeper into what shapes resilience, it's important to recognize that spatial systems are not static, they evolve, and often in nonlinear ways. Many systems operate through feedback loops. Conditions in one area can gradually reinforce or weaken conditions in another. Sometimes these changes are slow and almost invisible, until they accumulate and push the system past a threshold. That's when we see tipping points, sudden changes such as infrastructure collapse, ecosystem failure, or rapid shifts in community vulnerability. Understanding these dynamics is essential for resilience planning, because reacting after a threshold is passed is far more difficult. GIS helps us visualize these emerging patterns, identify areas approaching critical limits, and monitor early warning signals in space and time. It helps us anticipate change rather than simply respond to it. As we continue exploring how spatial systems behave, there's another key reality we need to consider: no system exists in isolation. Infrastructure networks, ecological processes, economic activities, and community life are tightly interconnected. This means that when a disruption occurs, whether it's a flood, a power outage, or ecosystem degradation, it rarely stays confined to one place. Instead, it cascades. A damaged road can disrupt supply chains, which then affects food access. A power failure can compromise healthcare facilities. A degraded watershed can increase downstream flood risk. These cascading effects are often invisible until we map them. GIS allows us to trace how disruptions travel across space, showing where systems are linked and where one failure could trigger another. By understanding these connections, we can identify critical dependencies and design resilient strategies that protect entire networks, not just individual sites. As we've seen, resilience is shaped by interacting systems, cascading effects, and spatial dependencies. But understanding these dynamics in abstract form can be difficult. This is where GIS becomes indispensable. GIS acts as a lens, one that transforms all of these complex relationships into patterns we can see, analyze, and discuss. Through maps, we can identify where hazards overlap with vulnerable populations, where infrastructure intersects with environmental risks, and where strengths or weaknesses are emerging across a region. By layering hazards, demographics, infrastructure, land cover, or climate data, GIS helps us pinpoint what is driving resilience or fragility in a particular place. The more clearly we can see these patterns, the more clearly we can design strategies that address them. In short, GIS does not just show us the landscape, it reveals how the systems within that landscape interact, and what those interactions mean for resilience. As soon as we begin using GIS as a lens, one of the most powerful capabilities we gain is the ability to integrate multiple layers of information into a single, coherent view. Resilience is never determined by just one factor. It emerges from how hazards, populations, infrastructure, and environmental conditions interact with each other. By bringing these layers together, GIS helps us see where risks accumulate, where critical assets are exposed, and where vulnerabilities are amplified by physical or social conditions. This multi-layer analysis allows us to understand resilience not as isolated issues, but as patterns that span neighborhoods, watersheds, regions, or entire systems. This integrated approach is essential for setting priorities. Instead of guessing which areas need the most attention, GIS gives us spatial evidence, showing exactly where interventions can create the greatest resilience gains. In short, multi-layer integration turns resilience assessment into a structured, transparent, and data-driven process. As we integrate multiple layers, the next major step is to translate that information into spatial patterns we can clearly interpret. Spatial vulnerability mapping does exactly this. It helps us pinpoint where risks are not just present, but concentrated in ways that increase the likelihood of severe impacts. By identifying hotspots, places where exposure, sensitivity, or limited adaptive capacity overlap, we can see which communities face the greatest burden. These clustered patterns are extremely important because they show us where resilience challenges are systemic rather than isolated. This approach supports more equitable decisions. Instead of distributing resources evenly or reactively, spatial vulnerability mapping tells us where targeted interventions will matter most. It also helps compare regions, revealing disparities that might otherwise remain invisible. Ultimately, vulnerability mapping transforms raw data into actionable insights, guiding us toward the areas that need attention first. Once we understand where vulnerability exists today, the next step is to look forward. Spatial resilience is not only about responding to current risks, it's also about anticipating how those risks may evolve. This is where scenario modeling and predictive spatial analysis become essential tools. Using GIS, we can simulate future conditions based on different assumptions, climate change projections, population shifts, land use changes, or new infrastructure plans. These models help us test how hazards might expand, where exposure could grow, and which systems may come under stress in the coming decades. What makes this so powerful is that it turns uncertainty into insight. Instead of waiting for vulnerabilities to emerge, we can identify potential future hotspots and plan early interventions. Predictive analysis supports long-term strategies, guiding investments toward solutions that will remain effective under multiple future conditions. In this way, scenario modeling helps resilience become proactive rather than reactive, helping communities prepare, adapt, and thrive even as conditions change. Now that we've looked at how scenario modeling reveals future risks, the next step is understanding what to do with that information. Not all areas will require the same level of support. Some communities face a combination of high hazard exposure, limited infrastructure, and low adaptive capacity, and these places often struggle the most during disruptions. GIS helps us identify these priority areas clearly and objectively. By overlaying risk layers, social vulnerability indicators, and capacity metrics, we can highlight the neighborhoods, towns, or regions where support is most urgently needed. This allows decision-makers to focus investments where they will have the greatest impact. Most importantly, this approach keeps equity at the center of resilience planning. Instead of distributing resources evenly or reacting only after crises hit, spatial analysis helps us target the communities that would otherwise be left behind. In this way, identifying priority areas becomes a crucial step in building resilience that is both effective and fair. Once we've identified which areas require the most urgent support, a broader question emerges: how do resilience patterns vary across the entire region? Not all communities start from the same point. Some have strong social networks, robust infrastructure, and access to resources. Others face chronic underinvestment, environmental burdens, and limited capacity to recover after disruptions. GIS allows us to compare these conditions across geographies, revealing where resilience is concentrated and where significant gaps exist. By looking at exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity side by side, we can see how different factors interact to create unequal outcomes. This comparison is essential for regional resilience planning. When we understand geographic disparities, we can design strategies that address them, closing gaps rather than widening them. It also helps leaders allocate resources more fairly and ensure that improvements in resilience benefit all communities, not just those already well equipped. As we look across different regions and begin to see where resilience is strong and where gaps remain, it becomes clear that we need a structured way to think about these patterns. This is where conceptual frameworks play a crucial role. Frameworks help us understand resilience not as a collection of isolated indicators, but as an interconnected system. They bring together social dynamics, environmental processes, infrastructure conditions, governance capacity, and community networks, showing how each contributes to overall resilience. Many modern frameworks also emphasize equity and inclusion. They remind us that resilience is not just about protecting systems, it's about ensuring people have the capacity, opportunities, and support they need to adapt. A community cannot be resilient if only some groups benefit while others remain vulnerable. By organizing complex spatial interactions into clear principles, these frameworks guide how we interpret data, how we prioritize actions, and how we design strategies that are both effective and fair. They give us the conceptual foundation needed to turn spatial analysis into meaningful improvements for real communities. In this topic, we explored resilience not as a single metric, but as a spatial system shaped by exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. We saw how risk is unevenly distributed, how geographic context influences outcomes, and why place-based analysis is essential for understanding vulnerability. We also examined the drivers and dynamics that shape resilience: natural systems, infrastructure networks, social structures, and the cascading effects that emerge when these systems are stressed. GIS gives us the tools to visualize these relationships, compare resilience across regions, and identify the communities that need the most support. Together, these ideas form the conceptual foundation for building more resilient, equitable, and well-informed strategies in the topics ahead.